coming to this special event. There's a program that is being out, and up on the left side is the order of the talks tonight. I always sort of viewed the JDM group as a community, and I think this event tonight is reflective of that. There's a continuity to it. One generation phasing out into the next, and we have multi-generations represented here tonight. Unfortunately, not the very first, some of the first generation, but we've got a lot of representation here, and we're very pleased to be here tonight to honor one of our pioneers, Sarah Lichtenstein. All of us have special people in our lives who have influenced the direction and the quality of our lives in important ways. Certainly our parents qualify as people who influence us, and often it's other family members, teachers, or a friend. For those of us who are academics, it may be an academic advisor, a mentor, a colleague, someone whose research inspires us. Glasses. See, when you get old, you need all those reading glasses. Sarah Lichtenstein has certainly performed all of these roles, and we're here tonight to describe some of them and recognize all she's done for us individually and collectively as members of the JDM community. Sarah's here tonight over in the corner there, and she's hoping we won't embarrass her too much. We'll try not to do that. First of all, I'd like to thank people who are important in helping us put this event on. Valerie Reyna, the president of SJDM, Michael Regenwetter, Gretchen Chapman, and other members of the program committee, Craig Fox, who was an advisor to us, Jim Chanteau, who unfortunately can't be here tonight. He's recovering from surgery, but he is recovering. Our presenters tonight, Alicia Warfield, and of course, Sarah. I'm going to give you some brief background on Sarah. It's kind of hard to summarize 50 years of collaboration and friendship in a few minutes, but I'll do my best. Sarah got her bachelor's degree in 1956 from Swarthmore College. She was majored in psychology. She took courses from people the likes of Solomon Asch. Then she went to Michigan to study in 1956 to study math psych with Clyde Coombs. And she got interested in decisions involving gambles because Coombs was then studying preferences among bets with his colleague Dean Pruitt. That was 1956. She came to Michigan. I came to Michigan in the fall of 1959, and I was given the job as a research assistant to Clyde Coombs, where I too became interested in studying gambles. It was kind of infectious, I think, at the time, and that's when I met Sarah. There was kind of a hangout room up on the 7th floor of Haven Hall, where all the math psych students had desks, and Sarah had a desk with her own special chair called Sarah's chair, and no one better sit in Sarah's chair. But she sort of intimidated me. I was a first-year person. It's like being a freshman in high school and meeting a senior who seemed so worldly and all-knowing. And so this first year, 1959, I don't think we interacted much. But then Clyde Coombs went on sabbatical in the fall of 1960. And those of us who were studying gambles were looking for another gambling researcher. And sure enough, there was Ward Edwards on the other side of campus who was also studying gambles. And so we both drifted over to start working with Ward Edwards. Ward suggested that Sarah and I team up on some research, and so we did a study that was related, a methodological study. She was studying preferences among certain types of gambles, and the question was how many gambles could we present to people before they got bored. So we did a study of boredom-induced preferences, which we worked together and eventually was published in 1965. It was by far not our best paper. But, Sarah defended her thesis in 1962 and may have been the first PhD in decision making. There really wasn't programs like that, and she sort of was self-taught. She never took a course in decision making. She just learned it through interacting with Ward and other students and reading. And in her dissertation, she had 14 references. And some of those were to a statistics book by Hsee and a conference paper. And she said, well, that was what the literature was in those days, 1962. That was kind of easy compared to now. So Sarah left then, and she traveled to several places. I left Michigan in 1964. I went to the Oregon Research Institute in Eugene, known as ORI. And in 1966, Sarah's husband, Ed, got an offer from the University of Oregon to come out there, and ORI enthusiastically offered Sarah a position at ORI, and I was thrilled that we were going to be reunited again. That was 1966. So we left our studies of boredom behind and began to investigate some more exciting topics, some of which you'll hear about tonight. Eventually, we collaborated on 2 books and 56 articles, jointly authored with many people, mostly with Baruch Fischoff, a lot of them with Baruch. But it wasn't all work. We found time to kind of explore Oregon a bit, as this picture shows, from 1966, when we found an old gold mining town, abandoned gold mining town, and we're using the lantern to kind of search this old gold mine. The town was named Quartzville, which suggests how unsuccessful the miners were in those days. The 2 older boys on the left are each now 50 years old, so you can see that time has passed in many ways. Let me just say a few words about Sarah as a colleague. She is kind of the quintessential experimental psychologist. She was trained, how to do very careful, controlled studies, and to design these studies very precisely, to conduct them just right, to analyze them very thoroughly, and then to report them clearly and concisely with very careful wording. I mean, she was just a very skilled at all facets of doing experimental research and editing studies. We often went through 10 or 15 drafts of a paper. These are in the days that if you did a draft of a paper, you had to retype it. I mean, it was carbon paper or whatever. You can have the copying or the computer. And Sarah also is quite a skilled editor. She she has done a lot of reviewing for journals and for NSF, and always gave very thoroughly extensive and constructive reviews to people. And outside of that, if anyone approached her for advice or wrote her a letter, she often would give quite a lengthy, careful, and constructive response to them. There were a few conferences in the early days. Ward Edwards started his Bayesian conference in 1962. Sarah and I attended that. Then Ken Hammond started the Boulder Conference, I think around 1968. Probably some people here would know exactly, but I think it was around then. And Sarah and I went to both of those conferences and were among the few that did that, and that was kind of instrumental in leading us to do this paper on comparing Bayesian regression approaches to information processing, which we did around 1970. In 1967, Sarah started something called the list, and I've got a few slides on that. List was a mailing list. It was a way for people to communicate in those days. We didn't have the internet. We didn't even dream of the internet. So people would mail out papers. To be on the list, you had to mail at least one or more items to everyone else on the list once a year. And so a typical letter, I kind of took the identifying information out of these letters, but Frank encloses the list and a copy of the rules for it. I'll expect you to distribute to the members some offering with explanation that you are thereby putting yourself on the list I'll add your name in the next revision. So this is kind of the way it went. And if you didn't send something once a year, you heard about it, and if you didn't respond, you dumped from the list. And there was no fooling around there. This is probably one of the milder. I don't have all these letters. This is a milder one. So she started in 1967. By 1982, it was clear that it was time to close this down. 15 years of this, and the list had grown. It was so many people on the list, it was hard to mail because you had to do postage, you had to do all this. It was a job even for people to keep up with the list. So this is her letter in which her swan song, in which the second paragraph, I'm writing to you now to announce I'm unilaterally closing down the list. She was in charge. She was unilaterally doing it, and there's several reasons, because it was getting big, and she didn't have the time to maintain it. And paragraph 2, other people were finding it onerous to participate. And point 3, a cheaper way of continuing the networking provided in the past by the list is now available through the Judgment and Decision-Making Conference. More details are given below. And then the end of the letter, the last paragraph, it's been an honor and a pleasure to serve as this list since '67, and it's served a vital function. Perhaps its very success has hastened its downfall. I'm optimistic that the JDM conference will provide for all of us the continuing link that I've so enjoyed in the past. So I think that the list was very central in helping people who are interested in JDM realize, connect with other people with similar interests, and to see that there was kind of a coherent body of research and theory that they could relate to. So it really was instrumental in laying the groundwork for the Society of Judgment and Decision Making. That first Judgment and Decision Making meeting was held in St. Louis in 1980. I think there was only about a dozen people, according to Jim Chanteau's reminiscences of this. 1980, 1982, and they called it the Midwestern Judgment and Decision Making Group. And 1982, I think Sarah looked at this acronym MJDMG and said probably UGG. It's one of her famous terms, and shortened it to JDM. So according to Jim, Sarah is the one who came up with JDM. In 1976, we were at ORI from 66, 76. ORI disbanded, and Sarah and Brooke Fishoff and I started the decision research. We didn't realize how difficult it would be to run a small research institute entirely on soft money, grants and contracts. Brooke and I didn't have much administrative talent to do that, and fortunately Sarah did. She was very skilled in budgeting, running meetings, overseeing all the operations of a private nonprofit research institute. And without her guidance, decision research would not have succeeded these past 35 years. I doubt that we would even exist today if it wasn't for the skilled administrative work, which she did on top of her scientific work. So that's my thank you to Sarah. We're going to go on with the program, and I'm not going to give extensive introductions to the people. They're all quite well known to you, and we're just going to go from here. So John Payne from Duke University will be our second speaker here. Set it up. Okay, John.
Thank you, Paul. It's a great honor, truly a great honor to be here tonight. I've known Sarah and Paul for a long time. In fact, as I was thinking about it, I probably have known Sarah second longest of anybody who will be speaking tonight besides Paul. I first met Sarah when I was a junior in college. I think I was 4 years old and she was 14. Paul, on the other hand, was at least 40, and he just has aged since then. As I said, this is a great honor. I will also say that in preparing for these remarks, I came away very humbled because as I was reviewing some of Sarah's work, stuff I've read many times, I realized that in many ways much of my career has been basically just following paths that she first blazed for the field, and that in many ways I've just sort of been repeating and following what she did early in her career. What I want to do in the 15 or 14 minutes I've got left is really try to put much of the early work together in terms of some broad themes. Now, I will take the liberty of a speaker and put my own spin, if you will, on some of these things. But I'm basically going to try to talk about her contributions in terms of what might be viewed as the 3 C's. That is, I'm talking about in terms of the idea of contingent decision making. That what we see is highly contingent on things like how we ask the question, how the options are described, the context, that it really does matter in terms of the tasks that people are faced. Second big concept that I will talk about is the idea of constructed preferences, or also constructed beliefs, that in some sense people do not have a set of well-defined values that they carry around with them, but as a consequence, when they are faced with a task, they sort of construct it as needed, both using the information that is there, the information that is in their memory, and the task demands that they face. And then an idea that is newer but sort of builds off of those first two, and that is the importance of choice architecture as a way to try to influence the decisions that people make. All 3 of those very common ideas in our field today can be traced back to ideas that Sarah sort of originated in her work. We'll talk about that. Okay. What I want to do is talk about 4 papers. The first one briefly will be the paper that was, that is actually off of Sarah's dissertation work. 2 things I will mention about this. One that's very important to me is that she was the first I know to use 3 outcome gambles. I've used 3 outcome gambles in much of my work for many years, including currently. I'm now acknowledging that it's actually all due to Sarah, but that will be the last acknowledgement of that point. The other thing in there, as I was rereading it, Sarah actually talks about in this paper the idea of lexicographic strategies being used to make risky choices. So, again, scooped by Sarah. Talk about 2 other papers. I mentioned that I first met Sarah as a junior. It was in 1968. She and Paul were nice enough to meet with this young, very young guy who was interested in decision making, and then followed up by sending me a pack of papers that I remember being about yay tall of Oregon Research Institute manuscripts, working papers and published papers, and I believe in one form or another these 2 papers were in there. What's notable about this paper here, and I want to stress it, is that in many ways it was one of the first framing papers in our field. You actually go back into it, what they are really talking about is taking one form of gamble called duplex gambles. Duplex gambles is a concept where you sort of take the gain part and you make it sort of probably winning a gain L0, and you combine it with a loss part, which is probably losing a certain amount, L0, and a decision maker has to play both of them to get their outcome. And compared that with a more standard 2 outcome gamble, gain or loss, and essentially argued that people would be really focused on the common, what they call risk dimensions, probably winning, probably losing, amount to win, amount to loss that were described, and really wouldn't be sensitive to underlying distributional properties like variance. Idea that displays really would drive the preferences that you saw. I later followed up on that with some work of my own where I sort of essentially just complemented it by giving people some problems using duplex gambles where the underlying distributions were the same, but the displayed values were different, and sure enough, people responded in different ways. Perhaps a better known paper is a monograph that they did also in 1968, where they talked about, again, people paying attention to the displayed information. Really, if you look at the paper, interesting in there is two things that have played big roles in our field since then. One was the idea that people's preferences would be driven, as you would expect, by the relative values they had, and how that was sort of driven their attention to things like amounts to be won, amounts to be lost, payoffs, and so forth. But another idea is in there, and that is the idea that the importance of information could also vary as a function of how you were asking the question. Were you asking for a bid? Were you asking for a rating? Whatever. And that leads to the question and the paper that I will spend most of my remaining time on, which is the 1971 paper on reversals of preferences between bids and choices in gambling decisions. It's obviously my own personal opinion, but I would rank this as one of the top 5 papers in the history of our field in terms of its impact. Because it really does introduce the notion of procedural variance and how your preferences can literally change from A preferred to B preferred to A by essentially making what looks like a relatively meaningless, not important change in how you ask the evaluation question. So let me talk a little bit about that and then get into the sort of issues of contingent decision-making constructed. For those of you who are not familiar with the paper, or it's been a long time, basically they came up with the idea of what's now called P-bets and dollar bets. These are the descriptions up there, very simple. And they asked people to make these evaluations in one of two ways. Either tell me which one of those two you prefer, or I give them each individually, and Chris will talk about how important the joint versus individual evaluation is, and essentially express your preference. Now, you would think that whatever you would prefer, you'd be willing to pay more for. Well, turns out decision makers typically would show a decision maker would say, all right, given a choice, I'll prefer to maximize the chances I'm going to win. Go with the P-bet. But when asked to sort of decide how much they'd be willing to pay, you would often find that she would say, well, I actually pay more for the dollar sign bet. Now, this result was so important and so striking that it has now been replicated, and replicated more. People have tried to figure out all sorts of ways to make it go away, and you can make it become less, or you can make it become more, but it is there. It's been extended to lots of other problems with lots of other response modes, but the key idea that how you ask the question matters has not gone away. It has stood the test of time. Doesn't matter where you're talking about. Naive people, experts, with money, without money, it's there. What's going on? Well, it turns out, I suspect that there are a lot of things going on. And one of the things about our field is almost any of the robust phenomena we have are multi-determined. That's sort of why they're so robust. But a key concept in there I still believe they had, and is still there, is this idea of anchoring in insufficient adjustment. Really the idea that what's going on here is people, in part in this task, shift their attention in the pricing test to the amount to win, and then make adjustments to take care of the other information, and those adjustments are insufficient. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about putting this in context. As I said, I think all of that leads to what has become a big theme in our field, the idea of contingent decision making. I have here a couple quotes, one by Hilly Einhorn and Robert Hogarth in an annual review that sort of talks about this as being the most important results, empirical results. Another that talks about this being the failures of invariance of various forms being so crucial. Putting this into a bigger picture, one of the things that the people in this room pretty much accept, but is really kind of a major contribution, again traced back to the work that Sarah did, was this idea that in many, many cases, not all, but many cases, our preferences are constructed. This construction will be shaped by the interaction between task and the properties of the individual. And I would argue at the core of that is this idea of selective attention. And the attention can either be driven by our own values, what's in the information in the display, what we've searched through our own memory, but it is going to be selective. And then, of course, this idea of choice architecture. I want to stress one last thing here that I think comes out of the preference reversal, and that is the idea that attention is both something that reflects our preferences and shapes our preferences. So it can be both what we value and what the task directs our attention toward. Last, let me say that Sarah has certainly been, key in many methods that we have used in our field. I won't have time to talk about all the contributions, but one of the other things Sarah is well known for is she took our research and applied it to public policy concerns. Again, that seems old now, it was new then, and these are just some of the areas in which that happened. And last, let me sort of end by saying that we talk a lot about Sarah in terms of all of her research, and I want to stress the contributions that she made for mentoring young researchers, including one named John Payne. And let me sort of end my last thing by saying, Sarah, thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Our next speaker will be Hsee, who has taken the concept of preference reversals to new heights, and I think I find very interesting what he will present about preference reversals. And yes, let me just stand up here. Good.
Okay, I also feel very, very honored to be here. When people see me, sometimes they say, "Oh, you are one of those preference reversal people." And I think in this sense, I'm really a Sarah person because much of my work was really inspired by Sarah's and Paul's pioneering work in preference reversal. And since Paul and John have done a great job introducing that work, and at Paul's request, I'm going to say a little bit about some work we have been doing that was inspired by the original preference reversal work that Sarah and Paul started. So, so in the classic preference reversal work, the preference reversal happens between two situations with different response type. So, for example, in one case it's pricing, in the other case it's choice. But typically, the evaluation mode is held constant. By evaluation mode, we mean whether options are presented side by side, we call joint evaluation, or one at a time, we call single evaluation. And so today, I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about some of the early work we did on this other type of preference reversal and some of the new direction. So this other type of preference reversal is what we call joint single evaluation preference reversal. In this case, the two options A and B are presented either jointly, comparatively, or one at a time, single evaluation. But in those two cases, the response type is typically held constant. For example, in both cases, it's pricing or willingness to pay. So let me give you a couple of old examples many of you may have seen. So in one of our experiments, we asked the college students who supposedly know ice cream very well to indicate their willingness to pay for 2 servings ice cream. And we told them this is a Haagen-Dazs ice cream. And we told them the exact size. So the left one is 8 ounce and put in a 10 ounce cup, and the right one is 7 ounce, put in a 5 ounce cup. And objectively, the one on the left should be better, because if you care about ice cream, the one on the left has more ice cream. If you care about cup, the one on the left also features a bigger cup. Right? So no matter what. And so, but what happens is that when we do joint and single evaluation, in joint evaluation, not surprisingly, people are willing to pay significantly more for the left one, for the right one. But in single evaluation, when each of one is evaluated in isolation, even though the dimensions are all given, the students are willing to pay significantly more for the one on the right. Okay, so this is one example. So this is what we call joint single evaluation preference reversal. We hold response type constant. It's all willingness to pay. Another quick example. So we asked the people to indicate their willingness to pay for 2 sets of dinnerware, second-hand dinnerware. And so the one on the left has 40 pieces, but 6 of them are broken, but the remaining are good. The right one has 24 pieces, and all of them are in good shape. Okay, in joint evaluation, people are willing to pay more for the one on the left. That's not surprising. After all, the one on the left dominates. But then in single evaluation, people are willing to pay more for the one on the right, the dominated option. And most of people would say this is dominant. But when I presented in Chicago, one economist said, this is not dominated, because it takes effort to throw away those broken ones on the left. But that's too much. Okay. But anyway, there's a preference reversal. Okay. So, so my colleague and I we proposed a theory we call general evaluability theory to explain this and many other preference reversals. But today I'm going to just briefly mention one component of that theory, and then I'll talk about some new direction. So the component is this. So we make a distinction between 2 types of differences on attribute. One is what we call incremental difference. Incremental difference is a difference in shade, bigger or smaller. For example, winning $10 versus winning $20. Okay. The other type of difference is what we call categorical difference. This is a difference in valence or in sign. So winning versus losing, or winning versus not losing. Okay. This is what we call categorical difference. So the basic thesis is that an incremental difference in a attribute makes a greater difference in joint evaluations than in single evaluation, because incremental difference can only be appreciated in joint evaluation, in direct comparison, but not in single evaluation. On the other hand, a categorical difference, a difference in valence, gain versus loss, gain or not gain, would make a greater difference in single evaluation than in joint evaluation, or at least the same difference. And because of that, we can explain a lot of joint single evaluation preference reversals. So for example, suppose you have two options, A and B, and those two options vary on two dimensions, x and y, and the difference on x is incremental. The difference on y is categorical, okay? And x is better than, A is better than x, y is better than, B is better than y. Then if there's a preference reversal, then the direction would be this. In joint evaluation, A would be preferred over B. In single evaluation, B would be preferred over A. So this can explain, for example, the ice cream study. The ice cream study, the absolute amount of ice cream is incremental difference, 7 ounce versus 8 ounce. But underfield versus overfield is categorically different. So we have this type of preference reversal. The same can be said of the dinnerware study. The absolute number of pieces, 40 versus 24, incremental difference. But whether there are broken pieces or intact, categorically different. So in single evaluation, categorical difference has a greater influence. Okay, so today, actually I'm going to say a little bit about the new direction we're taking. If we think about JDM, probably the three most important functions we study in JDM are utility function or outcome function. Outcome is any kind, for example, payment. Y is our value or utility. And time discounting function and probability weighting function. And all of those three functions are curvilinear, okay? And they are typically more steep around endpoints than in other places. Okay, so our hypothesis, based on the proposition I just made, is that if we compare these three different functions in two conditions, one is in joint evaluation, the other is single evaluation, then we would get this kind of result. So for each of these functions, single evaluation would lead to more concavity than joint evaluation. Why? The reason is, let's take a look at this. So take time discounting, for example. The difference between no delay versus some delay is a categorical difference. But the difference between a small delay and a large delay is an incremental difference. And according to the proposition we just made, a categorical difference would make a greater difference in single evaluations in joint evaluation, whereas the incremental difference would make a greater difference in joint evaluations in single evaluation. So in other words, no delay versus some delay would make a bigger difference in single evaluation than in joint evaluation. But the small delay versus large delay, well, greater, you can compare, so it makes a greater difference in joint than in single. And this same logic applies to all of those functions. Outcome function, probability weighting function, time discounting function. Now, certainly this is not the only factor that influence those functions. You know, many people here have done work to explore factors that influence the shape of those functions. But we thought this is one of many possible factors that can influence the shape of those functions. So what's the implication of this? The implication of this, let me skip this. Okay, the implication of this is, we can relate this to, again, two commonly studied preferences in JDM. One is time preference, one is risk preference. So let's first talk about time preference. A typical time preference problem is like this. You have two options, A and B. A features a larger outcome, but it's delayed. B features a smaller outcome, immediate. Okay, so the question is, do you prefer a larger delayed outcome or a smaller immediate outcome? Now notice in this kind of a setting, the difference between outcome size is incremental difference. But difference in delay, I mean time, is a categorical difference, delay versus no delay. Then, if there's a preference reversal, if this difference is big enough, then there will be a preference reversal, and the direction of preference reversal would be such that in joint evaluation, A would be preferred to B. okay? Because in joint evaluation, we can see the difference in size, outcome size. But in single evaluation, immediacy becomes more important because it's a categorical difference. So, so we recently run a study. It's a study with real consequence. We asked students to sign up for an experiment, and there are 2 experiments they can sign up for. One experiment would pay them $25, but the payment would not be delivered until after the summer break, 2 months later. Whereas the other experiment would pay them $10 right away. The 2 experiments, we told them exactly how long. Each experiment lasts about 40 minutes, and so on and so forth. And we asked them their willingness to, well, in this case, how much they want to participate in the experiment, and the people who indicated the greatest willing to participate would be called upon to participate and would be obligated to participate. So we get the predicted results. In joint evaluation, people are more willing to participate in experiment that pays a larger delayed reward than the other reward. But in single evaluation, the reverse is true. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the implication of this for, okay, I only need 2. The implication of this for now I can slow down a little bit, for risk preference. So for risk preference, again, suppose you have 2 outcomes. A features a larger risky reward, and B features a smaller sure reward. Okay, and this again is the typical problem we see in risk preference. Then again, the difference in outcome size is incremental. The difference in risk is categorical. Then we would have this kind of preference. Okay, in joint evaluation, people prefer A. In single evaluation, people prefer B. Okay. Again, we also have a similar kind of experiment, and the payment is either $40, but it's uncertain, okay, or it's $20 certain. And again, in joint evaluation, people prefer the experiment that pays risky $40 than certain $20, but in single evaluation, the reverse is true. So now, this is only true when the difference in outcome size is incremental, but the difference in time or risk is categorical. Sure versus risky, delayed versus no delay. But again, this is quite common. Typically, when we study time preference and risk preference, these are the kind of problem we face. So under those conditions, then these are 2, I think, pretty general findings. That is, we will observe greater time impatience in single evaluation than in joint evaluation. In terms of risk, we would see greater risk aversion in single evaluation than in joint evaluation. And the reason is all due to these 3 different functions. And they have different patterns in joint and single evaluation. And all of these are inspired by Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry to have to rush people through all these really interesting talks in such a short period of time. It's a very, very good job, Chris. Okay. Right here. So Eric Johnson is our next speaker. And get it up here.
No qualms. Okay. This is a direct quote. If you were listening to the tape that was being played over at the beginning, it's amazing. I heard that tape first as a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, and I thought it was the most amazing thing to see someone confronted so repeatedly with their own stupidity and for them never to reform. At one point, Sarah says, no qualms. Some people would say a pattern of responses, that is not a reasonable pattern. And this is a tribute to Sarah, because for many years she's been sitting at the back row on the edge telling us without any qualms how to get ideas to be better. And I've always appreciated that. I just thought it was a very nice way of thanking her. I want to do two things today. The first thing I want to do is talk about, in a actually broader sense, I think, of why preference reversals have been so important to the field. In fact, before I get started on that, I want to say, I looked at the program. We're at the point now where we don't use the word preference reversal anymore, but almost every paper has the following setup. I'm going to do something, make people hungry, relaxed, ... and what are they going to do? They're going to choose this in one condition and that in the other condition. And so the preference reversal has become such a fundamental unit of our experiments, we almost don't even have to call them that anymore. But it really is sort of, I think, a very fundamental part of what we are. And as Paul suggested, I'll talk very little at the end, because I think tonight should be all about Sarah, about the future of constructive preferences. History, we've already heard some of, but there's some very interesting things that I think we should think about. You know, as we were told at Michigan, Sarah worked with Paul and Ward Edwards, and they noticed something remarkable, that ratings of attractiveness sometimes differ from pricing. Now, this was pretty interesting. One small correction, by the way, to Chris, it was very nice work, but the actual pricing judgments in the original work were single evaluation. You actually got to see one gamble and price it. And of course, I thought that was true, but Sarah, of course, leans over immediately and says to John, that wasn't quite right, which is something that I loved about Sarah. She actually gets the details almost always exactly right. And there's a wonderful book. It's actually a mixed book. It's called Priceless. So a guy named William Poundstone wrote it, and it does contain some wonderful intellectual history of the field. And part of it are some interviews he did with Sarah and with Paul and a number of other people. But this is a quote. And I can just imagine sitting, in fact, the opening says, I don't remember if it was in Paul's office or mine, and this is a direct quote from Sarah, we were getting an idea of what subjects we're paying attention to. I don't recall who said it first, if we said it at the same time. But it struck us that we could design bets that most people would pick one way and choose another. And that sort of realization that happened, I think, was the beginning of the preference reversal. We saw it and said it aloud. We were sure it was going to work, and it did. And so we all have meetings with our co-authors where we sort of have that moment, you know, wouldn't it be really neat if? And it's nice to have that picture of that happening in Eugene that day. The next steps, now this is actually kind of interesting, because I think what we don't appreciate is how fundamental this idea has been, not just to the JDM community. After all, we matter somewhat, but there's a lot of other people out there. And you know, I'm going to take this to sort of argue it's been a fundamental beginnings of behavioral economics. That steps go like this. First, in some of that data, they actually showed that people are different when buying and selling the same bet. In fact, long before the endowment effect was found, you know, it was not, you know, the endowment effect existed in their data. In that famous tape, Poundstone has this great line. It says, Lichtenstein's talk delivery is as perfect as a Elaine May routine. And if you listen, that's exactly what it is. You know, no qualms. But the thing I think we've shown pictures, and for a lot of the younger people, that picture of the Four Queens Casino might not be as obvious as what it is. That is actually, it's outrageous to think about now. But I think it would be even more outrageous to think about back then. Let's take a PDP-7 computer, which is about the size, I think, of 2 refrigerators. Take it to Las Vegas, program it, and have gamblers, real gamblers, play this game. If I remember reading correctly, there were probably a total of 58 complete subjects, because most gamblers like to be mindless and press buttons and all of this. This took a couple hours to play. The little screen that you see on that picture you've seen a couple times was the display of the PDP-7. And they actually was professional, not croupier, but whatever you call those folks, actually running these games. And so it just seems outrageous. In these days, field studies are considered cool. This was cool before field studies were cool. It's really pretty ridiculous. It was other thing that Poundstone makes a very nice observation. This is the fairest game in all of Las Vegas, because unlike every other game, it actually paid you a decent bet. There was no talent margin. Despite that, I think they had 58 subjects. But that was more than enough, because it actually, with real mistakes, presented the results beautifully, replicated the results beautifully. Now, along comes Charlie Pott and David Grether, who are economists who want to say, this is not real because it's really disturbing to us economists. And in a paper that's eventually published in AER, they replicate this beautifully with real stakes, but they have a list of 14 desiderata, why this could not possibly be real. And on that list was reason number 13. I think the number may have been chosen purposely. The experimenters were psychologists. And so they made a big point of telling their subjects, we're economists, not psychologists. And of course, they replicated the result perfectly. So immediately, this actually became an amplifier. It left our little community and became something that was incredibly important to economics as well. And I think that's something that, even though we are a family and very much a community, you know, I think it's nice that happened. In fact, it's more than nice. In fact, Poundstone has this great quote, and forgive me, I think I'm going to read the whole thing because it's so cute and true. He says, from today's perspective, Lichtenstein and Slovic started a revolution. The preference reversal experiment can be made with some justice compared to the Michelson-Morley experiment in physics. Their experiment refuted the absolute velocities of 19th century physics, laying the groundwork for Einstein's relativity. It is tempting to draw a parallel between the physicist's ether and the economist's utility. Both were invisible, impalpable, tasteless somethings that existed simply because everyone assumed they had to exist. By showing that there are no invisible valuations dictating all economic decisions, Lichtenstein and Slovic heralded the relativity of prices, a keystone to what would be called behavioral economics. I think that's just a very nice positioning of how important this work was. Okay, so actually, I was thinking, you know, if we don't call preference reversals anymore, if we were a discipline that appreciated our history, we probably would have given the units of analysis the name of its inventors. So they would have been called, my data contains so many Lichtenstein Slovics. But since that's not very convenient, we'd probably say Lichtenvix, or Elke and I have been talking, is it Lichtenvix, Lichtenvix? We end up spitting all over each other. But nonetheless, I think it would be a nice thing to do is actually think about naming these units, or at least appreciate them. They really are preference reversals in lots of our work. Okay, so to look at the future, and I want to be brief because this evening should really be about Sarah. The thing that has bugged me for a long time, since actually I met Sarah in 1979 at a student conference in Göteborg, and I can remember pleasing my elders. I was a young graduate student. Showed up, there was a great party, and with large jugs of wine, corked, and no one had a corkscrew. Back in those days, you could actually travel with a Swiss Army knife. And I had a Swiss Army knife. So I think the party was a little bit better for my contribution, but the idea of it being a community struck me because you got to sit and listen to people like Sarah, Paul, Guru, tell stories about when they were graduate students, and that was just marvelous. And I think that sort of oral transmission is something I think Paul is very much right. So the thing that has bugged me, probably not since then, but for a long time, is if we agree preferences are constructed, how are they constructed? You know, it's one thing to describe the phenomenon, it's another thing to understand what are the underlying things. And the challenge, I would argue, is not what some economists believe, that we don't really have preferences. The problem is we have a surplus of preferences. It's not a paucity, it's a surplus. We all want to be skinny, we all want to exercise, we all want to stay in bed. And we all have too many conflicting goals. And the question is, how do we resolve those? As Whitman said, I'm large, I contain multitudes. As opposed to the somewhere, Emerson, consistency, the hobgoblin of fools. Whitman had it right. We really do want many things, and the subset of those things we consider at any one point in time is, I think, really the key to the preference reversal phenomenon. For the last few years, our lab group, and our lab group includes lots of people I mentioned as I talked about the work itself, has basically been thinking about preferences as being a retrieval process. Preferences being retrieved from memory. To respond to a preference question, it is true that attention has shifted to one element or the other, but that's a reflection of a process that's going on in the back of the brain. We're retrieving, as I've tried hard to get the entire list together, past experiences, feelings, facts, and beliefs in trying to predict which of these two things will be better for me. We must retrieve the experience using the same memory system that we use more generally. Just like we retrieve different subsets of the states, there's classic memory demonstrations, name all 50 states. People typically retrieve a subset of that. Interesting thing is they don't retrieve the same subset every time they're asked. They retrieve different subsets depending upon what states they've heard of lately, things like that. So the argument here, we retrieve a different subset of our experiences, feelings, facts, and beliefs, something we call aspects, whenever I'm trying to do an evaluation task or a choice task. So I'll just give you two brief examples. Before I get into this, since Chris did a nice job of introducing it, there's a whole new realm of preference reversals that has really been exploding in the last 10 years. And these are preference reversals in intemporal choice. Why I will, and they have the following characteristic. I have something now and something later. Let's add a constant, so this would be very consistent with Chris' idea, to both times. So instead of wanting $20 now or $25 in 2 weeks. Everyone says $20 now. Add 50 weeks to each. So I can have $20 in 50 weeks or $25 in 52 weeks. Now people take the larger, later amount. That reversal has been the real motivation for a whole area that sometimes is called hyperbolic discounting, or if you're really into Greek letters, beta delta models. Okay. So one of the things about this literature that has been very important, very interesting, is we know people are much more patient when you're asked to accelerate consumption than delay consumption. A quick example, if I ask you, if you're ordering something from Amazon, and I say, how much would I have to pay you to wait an extra 2 weeks? You'll be relatively impatient. But if I have to ask you, how much would I have to ask you to speed it up 2 weeks? You're actually much more patient. So the direction of adjustment is what makes the time. So in a paper that a number of students in Elke and I wrote and published in Psych Science, we argued this is because the retrieval process is different. When I'm doing an acceleration decision, what am I doing? I'm thinking about all the uses, all the good things I could do with the thing on the first date. Because of output interference, I can't think of that much more of what I would do immediately. Now think about the reverse. You mean I'm going to get that iPod right now? And then I ask, and so what would I do with it in addition in 2 weeks? Very hard to generate that second category. And we show in that paper 3 things. One is people's recall of what they think about is different in the 2 tasks. Second thing is you actually can make the effect go away by changing the order in which things happen. And finally, we have a nice little reaction time study that shows that the accessibility of the information in memory is different in each condition. So this is actually sort of connecting memory with the classic attentional explanations that Sarah and Paul used. In fact, sort of to take that computer that was in the Fort Queens Casino long ago, many years forward, there's a new technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what TMS lets you do is essentially turn off a section of the brain. And along with Bernd Figner and a number of other of our co-investigators, we started looking at areas which actually prevent you from switching what we call queries. You can think about one way, but not the other. In a paper that was just published recently in Nature Neuroscience, Bernd had the very interesting idea, why don't we take the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is an area that's very much involved in cognitive control. And what we show is kind of neat. On the left, but not the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you can turn it off. By the way, I should say turn it off. It is temporary. It actually have to do the task very quickly because 10 minutes it's gone. Believe me, it's okay. We did it in Switzerland, but did have IRB approval in the United States. But what's interesting is that people who have TMS applied to the left dorsolateral prefrontal become incredibly impatient. They'll take almost any bet that has now involved. And actually, the interesting thing to me is that technology is involved from basically when the computer was the size of 2 refrigerators to the fact that we now actually can image and turn off sections of people's brains. This is all in the space of 30 or 40 years. I'll just close by thinking, do you think what we'll be doing in another 30 or 40 years from now? It's going to be pretty exciting, isn't it? So Sarah, thank you very much for everything.
Okay, we're going to switch from preference now to risk perception. Elke Weber will do the next presentation.
Well, I just want to reiterate what the previous speakers have mentioned, what a great honor and pleasure it is to be here. And not just to be here, but also to have known you for a long time. Sarah and I haven't met many times, probably at the Bayesian conference, 20-some years ago for the first time, and then over the years, sort of having at least 2 nice dinners together. But always has been quality time, and I feel I know you so much through the papers you've written, so thank you. I was asked to talk about Sarah's work on risk perception, and but also want to sort of start out with a somewhat broader introduction. And just reiterate what we've heard already, that Sarah really has been a trailblazer and a pioneer in almost all of the leading JDM topics that we've been pursuing for the last 40 years or so. From preference construction, which we heard about a lot already, a decision analysis and uncertainty assessment that Robin Gregory will be talking about, probability and confidence judgments, a huge, important contribution on that front. And then last but not least, risk perception, and I think John very rightly calls it the queen of risk. Also, in terms of methodologies, and again, I'm just listing 2 examples, and you've seen many others, and you will see many others. The preference reversal paradigm, hugely important. What I will talk about a little bit more is her important innovation on establishing that risk perception is a construct that's real and that's important. Let me just sort of intersect something more personal before I do that, and talk about Sarah's important role as a role model. When I started out in the field in 1980 or so, that's I guess 30 years ago, the room didn't look quite like the room looks today. There were very few women, there were very few senior women, and on the risk front, well, on any front, there was Lola Lopez, there was Maya Bar-Hillel, and then there was Sarah, and Sarah probably was the most senior of them all. Barbara Mellers and Valerie Reyna and myself became known in the mathematical psychology circles as the risky sisters. But I just want to say, if we became sisters in our risk research, and certainly Sarah was our mother, so thank you. So, let me say something about also, before I get to the risk research, I want to have a picture of Sarah the way John did. So I Googled Sarah Lichtenstein image, and this is what I got. Of course, I also got Sarah Lichtenstein from Facebook. But I think this really probably could very well be 1970 Sarah Lichtenstein by Roy Lichtenstein, who, for all we know, might be related to her. Also completely besides the point, but Roy Lichtenstein did not get tenure at Ohio State. We speeded up his career in New York. So, back to our topic. Sarah's impact on risk research. Before I sort of talk about the many contributions that her initial studies made to that topic, let me remind all of us, of what this research was about. Basically, Sarah, together with Paul and Baruch, set out to study why Americans were so irrational when it came to nuclear power. I think this research was funded by the nuclear power industry, and the question was why did the American public not agree with the experts in the field, and by any sort of mortality, morbidity, safety statistics, nuclear power was a safe energy source. Of course, it's interesting we're coming back to that, but for different reasons these days. But what Sarah and her collaborators did, they just asked members of the general public to judge the similarity of different types of risk. And you might not be able to sort of read this very well, but on the sort of top right quadrant we have various, I can't read this without my glasses either, but various nuclear power things, but different sort of health and safety hazards that vary on multiple dimensions. And so people judged the similarity of those risks on some rating scale, but they also then judged these different risks individually on a variety of dimensions, like how voluntary it was, how many people would die at any given time when things went wrong, and how familiar people were with these technologies. And then essentially established a multidimensional scaling solution that they then reduced to the number of underlying dimensions based on people's ratings of these dimensions. And by now we all know these different factors, and they've been sort of reduced more to 2 classes of factors having to do with sort of dread and having to do with how much we know about things. But this research has been vastly influential in the risk society, risk analysis society, in psychological research and in economic research. It did a variety of things, and I should also say I started out, my PhD research was on risk perception. And when I first presented my research at the Bayesian meeting, Paul Ward Edwards came to me afterwards and says, risk, judging which lottery is risk here, I mean, that's nonsensical. He was trained as an economist in some sense, and he sort of bought into the sense that there was nothing that was observable about differences in risk. It was a purely subjective judgment. And the question is, well, what was it based on, and did it matter? Well, I think sort of what we have shown in the intervening 30-some years is these judgments do matter, risk perceptions matter, in part because they influence our willingness to take risks. our perceptions of risk are not just consequential. Of course, they are consequential. We do care about mortality and morbidity. We do care about outcomes and probabilities. But those are not the only factors in any given situation that influence our feeling of risk. And again, this is another sort of major contribution that Sarah and collaborators anticipated the emotions revolution of the last 20 years by at least a couple of decades. And also the recent work on decisions from experience versus decisions from description, basically showing that in certain situations, more analytic factors play a larger role, in other situations, more experiential and emotional factors play a larger role in our evaluations and in our actions based on these described risky situations. They also showed that by implication, since our evaluations are not just consequential and therefore are the same for everyone at every different point in time, they also showed that these perceptions of risk are subjective, and subjective in multiple ways. One of them is, they can be relative, and again, a lot of our subsequent research has looked at the question, well, how risky something, how variable something compared to what? Many of our evaluations, whether their individual outcomes are relative compared to what? That's what prospect theory is based on. But the same is true also for judgments of variability. So some recent work, for example, has looked at the coefficient of variation that looks at variability not in absolute terms, but relative to the expected value, relative to that reference point, and shows that the coefficient of variation predicts the risky actions of a wide variety of species better than the absolute value of standard deviation, from bumblebees to people. Also, another aspect of risk judgments being subjective is that they can be domain specific. It matters whether it's a variability in the financial domain and that financial risk is seen as an investment or seen as a gamble. It matters whether the risk is social as opposed to health and safety as opposed to ethical. And again, it's sort of as a reference to these different psychological risk dimensions being more or less salient in these different domains that explains these differences. Also, do they matter? Yes, they matter, because these different perceptions of risk drive different actions on the risk. And so people are not consistently risk averse or risk seeking across domains. They're quite inconsistently so. But if you factor out their own perception of the riskiness of the situation, which in turn can be explained by Sarah's psychological risk dimensions, their willingness to trade off perceived risk against perceived benefits actually becomes a trade-like measure. And lastly, sort of relating to the work that I've done with Hsee, actually, another sort of a couple of decades ago almost, also risk perceptions oftentimes depend on culture. And so different cultures drive different evaluations, and the psychological risk dimensions have different familiarities, and culture can mean men versus women, it can mean Chinese versus Americans, or it can mean Republicans versus Democrats. And I think sort of understanding better that risk is something that is emotional, oftentimes out of anthropology, is a reaction to something that scares us because it challenges our sort of established values or our established and cherished ways of life. It helps to explain and perhaps understand and counteract some of the disagreements we've been having. Talking about disagreements, let's talk a little bit about the scientific and but also social relevance of Sarah's work in this domain. This psychological risk dimension work really continues to explain many of our political debates, whether it's disagreements between domain experts and the general public. There's a work, for example, on flood insurance and people's unwillingness to buy even subsidized flood insurance that a lot of people in the audience have been working on. Actuaries versus floodplain residents, pediatricians making different recommendations and having different feelings about vaccination and the safety of vaccination than parents. But then also disagreements between observers that have sort of different degrees of knowledge and different political ideologies. So most recently the work on climate change risks and how the difference in which these risks are being perceived by scientists on the one hand, the general public on the other hand, and then also different parts of the general public, Democrats, Republicans, and so on. All right, I'm a mathematical psychologist, so I want to give you some numbers. And these numbers are mouth-watering. In fact, many of us would be lucky to have like one or two of these publications as our lifetime publication record. But we'll just start out with some statistics that I collected in 1998 when I took over the HDP part of OBHDP, which at the time had been edited by Jim Naylor for 33 years. And sort of, I wanted to understand what journal I was taking over and what field I was, sort of taking over a journal for. So I did an analysis of the content of the journal, but also at the most highly cited publications. There was a list of golden oldies, and those were the 10 publications that had the highest citation record published, I think, before 1980. And out of those 10 golden oldies, Sarah owns 3. The number 1, the comparison of Bayesian and regression approaches in 1971. They had a citation count at the time of 777. Since then, has gone up by another 120 to 895. Number 6, the work on knowing sentient metacognition, citation count of right now of 322. And then training for calibration, 161. That's just OBHDP, and here's just like a selected subgroup of additional papers. Of course, the 1977 annual review chapter, 575, and I should say this is not Google Scholar, this is ISI Web of Science. These are real citations. On preference reversals, sort of 3 papers, including the AER in 1983. The 2 papers, or just the 2 papers on confidence that I looked at, the most highly cited ones, and also on probability judgments here at the bottom. The other thing I want to point out is, I think John already mentioned this, Sarah also has been very prescient in the environmental focus of her work, sort of policy applications, and in particular environmental policy applications. And just sort of look at the publication dates, 1993. I mean, environmental risk perception was just a glimmer in most of our eyes. Preference reversals in the measurement of environmental values in JRU. Valuing environmental resources, a constructive approach, essentially sort of telling economists how they should be doing contingent valuation, which already has 154 citations, and then more recently her work on taboo values, affect and cognition, and its applications to how we might be able to reform our environmental actions and attitudes. So in closing, let me just sort of show you another graph of Sarah's risks. And let me end by thanking you again very, very much.
I think with these beautiful talks we've had, we see that we really have learned something in 40 years.
So I'm supposed to be speaking about Sarah's contributions in the field of decision analysis. And since I'm not a real decision analyst, as Sarah knows, I was talking with Ralph Keeney a few days ago, and Ralph asked if it would be okay if I read off a very short comment from Ralph in honor of Sarah. Ralph is a true decision analyst. So here's just a few sentences from Ralph, who dearly loves Sarah. It says, Sarah, in working with you on aspects of several projects over the years, and especially on the book Acceptable Risk, it was readily apparent that you contribute depth and breadth of detail in the big picture. Your direct contributions are always substantial, and you subtly nudge others with your normal, gentle nudging style to raise the quality of their efforts. I always enjoyed and appreciated your thoughts and ideas, even when I disagreed or could not understand them. Very Ralph comment. You have always been a consummate professional and wonderful colleague. Simply put, you have contributed intellectually and personally to the lives of many, and certainly I am one of the lucky ones. Thank you and congratulations. So that's from Ralph. So John Payne's slides, which I enjoyed, introduced Sarah's role in mentoring younger researchers. And I was one of those lucky people. Although I must admit my road to working with Sarah was somewhat indirect. I first started working with Paul, who always seems so wise and so nice. And then I worked with Baruch, who seems so clever and unusual. And only after a few years at Decision Research, I started working there in 1984, did I begin to work with Sarah, who was and is wise and nice and clever and unusual. But first I had to overcome a not unnatural fear of Sarah, because in addition to all those other attributes, she's also very direct. And for a young researcher, particularly one not formally trained in experimental psychology, there's just seemed to be so much to learn about how to design a decent experiment, how to analyze results with some mixture of confidence and humbleness, and then write the whole thing up for review by the world. So, but there was Sarah in the Decision Research Office, there was me, and before long we did start to work together. So I think my big break came in connection with work that Ralph Keeney, Lefton Winterfeld, and others were doing as part of their decision analysis of siting options for the ill-fated high-level nuclear waste repository. One of us, either Sarah or me, I don't remember whom, was asked to review their analysis as part of a series of related papers in the journal Risk Analysis. The work got us talking together, and I found that Sarah, somewhat to my surprise, was extremely easy to work with. Echoing the comments of others today. From the start, she established a feeling of comfort and camaraderie, and I very quickly overcame that initial fear. I felt that if I had good ideas, they could be as good as any of Sarah's good ideas. And if I had bad ideas, or incomplete ideas, or what Sarah termed yuck ideas, Y-U-K, one of the great Sarah words, then they would be no worse than parallel thoughts that she or Ralph or anyone else might have. All humans were equal in Sarah's eyes, not only men and women, but also psychologists and partially reformed economists. So these initial sessions with Sarah led me to working quite intensively with Ralph and Detloff over the succeeding 10 years, up to today. And each step along the way, I benefited greatly from Sarah's strongly behavioral take on what a decision analyst might be up to and why. At the time, I also was working in parallel fashions on critiques of behaviorally deficient methods used by economists, especially contingent valuation and other survey-based approaches. Then after the Exxon Valdez spill in the late 80s, Paul and Sarah and I were sitting around in the only room at Decision Research where Sarah was allowed to smoke, talking about what was being done right and wrong in the post-spill analyses, and I think Paul had been asked to do something on this. And we began to think more deeply about how their shared work, Paul and Sarah's work on constructive preferences, really formed the basis for our dislike, our deep dislike of what the CVM guys were up to, contingent valuation guys were up to. So this led to this 1993 paper, Valuing Environmental Resources, a Constructive Approach, which was probably the first really good paper I had first authored. And it includes this aside that preference construction is more like architecture than archaeology, because an individual's true preferences are formed through the elicitation process, rather than merely tucked away where only a sharp economist can find them. And I think these conversations in many ways form the basis for what I've been doing ever since. And I remember really clearly how Sarah would go over and over our sentences in the flow of our logic, wanting to both be clear and to pack some intellectual force, but really emphasizing that we should never exceed what we knew, never bluster, never stand without a solid foundation. So there are many evenings in the early mid-90s that I rode my bike home in the dark from the Decision Research office. My head was swimming with a sort of peculiarly early 40s mixture of annoyance and appreciation for the clarity of Sarah's thinking and her unrelenting standards of good writing and eloquent thinking. So one other big lesson I've learned from Sarah is that ethical and moral issues have a central place in whatever we do. And I really hold Sarah up as a standard for myself in terms of ethics and morality. If I feel that a method of getting information from people for public policy purposes, and for me it's mostly in the environmental management area, if I feel that a method is not ethical, and if I can defensively argue that point, then it deserves to be said. And that's something that I think I very much learned from Sarah. Sarah drove this point home to me as part of a 1990 paper writing effort that she led, along with the European researcher and gambling master William Wagner and Paul and myself, for the tribute volume of essays written in honor of Hillel Einhorn. This paper is titled When Lives Are in Your Hands. Remember that? And this essay, 90% of which was written by Sarah, examines the responsibilities of a person who makes risky decisions on behalf of others and explores, quote, a few cases in which it could be argued that a societal decision maker in making his or her decisions should, in good conscience, disregard the desires or beliefs of the affected people. It's very much a Sarah sentence. For a kid who came of age in the late 1960s, this was serious stuff. But by the end of our writing process, I came to agree with Sarah, as I think most readers did as well. We returned to some of these same issues in the last paper I worked on with Sarah and Julie Irwin, which looked into taboo responses, the one that Elke just referred to. Decision situations so objectionable or so repugnant that people may refuse to make a choice, hence taboo responses. The decision analysis side of me always says, structure, decompose the problem, make it less difficult or confusing, and people can handle it. But with much help from Sarah's experimental frame of mind, it turns out there are some topics or policy issues where taboo responses are driven primarily by affect, and thus disapproval really isn't a valuation process, it's an attitude measure. And I think for such decision situations, what's bad is easy, as Sarah came to title the paper. So once again, I benefited greatly from Sarah's ability to cut into a rich, cross-disciplinary mess that combined psychology, decision analysis, ethics, economics, and helped to make sense of it all. And there's a side lesson here in this paper. Other ones that I've done with Sarah. Sarah puts a tremendous amount of work into many of the things that I've worked on. The Hillel Einhorn chapter, when lives are in your hands, I remember Sarah put far more work into that chapter than I possibly could have imagined to be appropriate. Partly because of her admiration for Hillel Einhorn, but also, as I've seen many times over, because that's what it takes to do a good job in any piece of writing. Many times since then, as I volunteered days or weeks or months of time on a project, long after the research grant was over, I thought of Sarah's willingness to work overtime, usually without pay, on tasks that she considered to be important, whether they're book chapters or experimental designs or just nagging line entries in the decision research budget, as Paul alluded to. And I've often told myself, you're not slow, Robin, you're just doing a good job. And it's the same thing that Sarah would have wanted you to do. So one last reason why I treasure my friendship and colleagueship with Sarah is that she's just a wonderful person. And I think that's part of why we're all here. Kind of a one-off cross between, I tried to think of people, some combination of people who might make Sarah, and I came up with three: Eleanor Roosevelt, Dorothy Parker, and Elizabeth Salander from the Steve Larson books. So, Alicia appreciates that. So think about that. Some combination there where you get something kind of close to Sarah. Eleanor Roosevelt, Dorothy Parker, Elizabeth Salander. Sarah is the tireless champion of equal pay for women and the tireless critic of stupidly paternalistic men, of whom there were and remain far too many. But she's also the kindly, warm-hearted, and wine-friendly Sarah who became a favorite of my wife Terry and my two kids back when they were in elementary school. To this day, if I mention to Sean or Nikki, my kids who are now in their 20s, that I will be seeing Sarah, their voice softens and they always ask me to say hello, which they both have done. Who else do I know who combines a love of trashy paperback novels with a deep understanding of multi-attribute utility analysis? Who else do I know who would encourage me to write my thoughts about something and then cover the pages with margin notes saying yuck? But still, Sarah would be there the next day to talk over these ideas, to work over the writing, and to make it all into something passable. And then as we worked more, into something useful, and then perhaps, after many drafts, into something that just shines just a little. So if Sarah is the queen of risk, then I applaud her willingness to also do the heavy lifting and the wash the dishes, detailed, word by word, response by response analysis that very few queens are willing to do. So Sarah, you're one of my all-time favorites, mentor, friend, inspiration. It's a pleasure to join everybody and honor you tonight.
Thank you, Rob. I had the pleasure of working more recently with Sarah and shares Sarah's admiration of nifty experiments, which she'll talk about next. Thanks.
So, Robin, first, you're going to be a really hard act to follow.
Yes.
The assignment that I was given today for Sarah's tribute was this idea that Sarah likes nifty experiments. And so, and she's conducted many nifty experiments herself, like the study that was done in the Four Queens Casino in Las Vegas. What I'm going to do today is show you three studies that I hope you will find to be nifty experiments. I know you will let me know afterwards whether or not you thought they were nifty experiments. In one of the studies you've actually seen before. But what I'd like to talk about is what may be sort of a new kind of preference reversal, although apparently preference reversals don't exist anymore or aren't called that. But it's based on the idea of selective attention being at the core of preference construction processes, similar to what John was talking about earlier. And what I'd like to do is show you 3 studies where I use a manipulation of attention to shape preferences, to shape information processing actually, and to shape the construction of preferences in what I call a mere looking effect, for lack of a better word. Let me tell you first about the attention manipulation that I'm going to use. So the attention manipulation is one that's a covert manipulation of attention. It's something that is apparently outside of people's awareness, although research has shown that they have some control over it. But it comes from a low-level numeric cognition literature that shows that spatial attention is associated with the mental number line, such that small numbers are associated with left-hand space and large numbers are associated with right-hand space. And in fact, Fisher et al. Back in 2003 did a very nice study where they showed 2 boxes on a computer screen side by side, and they put either a 1 in between those 2 boxes or a 9 in between those 2 boxes. So a small digit, and that's associated with left-hand space, or a large digit, and that's associated with right-hand space. And then later on there's a variable delay, and then a box showed up, a dot showed up someplace on the screen. And the subject's task was, if the dot shows up inside one of the boxes, what I want you to do is just press the space bar. And it doesn't make a difference whether it shows, which one of the boxes it shows up in. If it shows up in a box, just press the space bar. So what they hypothesized, and indeed what they actually ended up finding, was that when a small number, like a 1 or a 2, was shown in between those 2 boxes, subjects were actually faster to detect a dot in the box on the left, because small numbers are associated with left-hand space, than they were to detect a dot in the box on the right. And with large numbers, like an 8 or a 9, the reverse happened. They were faster to detect a dot in the box on the right than one on the left. And the idea is that there seems to be this very interesting involuntary activation of a mental number line just in the mere presence of integers. And to go on, that there's also an interaction between cognitive systems that control number recognition and those that control visual attention. What I was most interested in, though, is just the general notion that just the mere presence of integers can actually cause this very subtle shift of attention. And so why might we care? Well, we might care because it might matter for decision making. As Eric talked about earlier, there's data from query theory. There's also data from information distortion studies that suggests that information that's accessed earlier, presented earlier, or chosen earlier sometimes by the subject appears to have a disproportionate influence on choice. And so what I was interested in was this idea that if numbers can covertly shift attention just a little bit, is it possible that the subsequent mere look at information might ultimately influence decisions? And so we did 3 different studies that I'm going to tell you about today. 2 of them are pretty simple, and I'll go through them quickly. The third is a little longer. The first study, I didn't believe it was going to work. So we did this silly little study in the student union at the University of Oregon. We literally took a piece of cardboard, we taped 2 identical erasers side by side, and we jammed either a large number 1 in between them or a large number 9 in between them. And what we were interested in was the idea that if it is the case that a number 1 will just barely shift visual attention over to the left, and people therefore look at the eraser on the left earlier, is it possible that they might actually prefer it? So what happened? It turns out that indeed, subjects who had a number 1 in between the two erasers were much more likely to choose the left side eraser, whereas those who had a 9 in between the 2 erasers were more likely to prefer the eraser on the right. Numeric magnitudes not only biased attention, but that mere look at information also biased choices. Now, of course, it could be that early attention to an option may simply have led to more positive evaluations. Whatever you look at first, you like better, and it may be there may therefore be preferences for whatever the early attended object is, kind of like a mere exposure effect. So we did another study where we actually, first, we're no longer in a really well-controlled environment. We went up and used an internet sample, and we borrowed materials from Eldar Shafir and some of his colleagues, where they had people, and we then had people choosing between 2 vacation spots. There was spot A on the left, which was all average weather, average beaches, average this, average that. But then there was also spot B on the right, which was an enriched option. And in that enriched option, the enriched option had positive attributes, like lots of sunshine, but it also had negative attributes, like very cold water. And what we did was just a very simple little 2x2 design where we either jammed a number 9 in between the 2 options in order to gear attention to the right, or we jammed a 1 in between the 2 options, in which case we expected attention to be diverted over to the left. We also, however, counterbalanced the order of whether the positive attributes were on the top or the negative attributes were on the top. And what we hypothesized was that if there was a 1 in between the 2 options, it wouldn't make a difference what the order of the attributes on the right were. Because if there's a 1 in between the 2 options, it should divert attention over to the left, and people should give a disproportionate there should be a disproportionate influence of the information on the left. So what's going on over on the right Shouldn't matter. But what happens if you put a 9 in between the two, and presumably attention is shifted slightly over to the right? And in fact, what you find is that many more subjects, if these negative attributes were on top, switched and they chose over to the left. And for those people who had these positive attributes on top, they were actually more likely to choose right side spot B. Merely looking at the information appeared to bias choices based not on just preferential, not just preferring whatever was attended first, but on actually processing the first information that was attended. And so we went on from there a little bit, still continuing with the idea of using attention to shape the processing of information and ultimately to shape the construction of preferences. And there's a lot of older research, part of which actually shows up in some of Sarah's research, about the analogy of figure ground illusions with the construction of preferences, and with attention being important to both of those. And so in figure ground illusions, if you pay attention to the white stuff in the middle, you can see a vase. But if instead you switch your attention and you pay attention to the black stuff on the outside, suddenly it's two people facing one another. And so one of the questions I had is, in this case, if you just simply switch your attention, you see two different things. Well, is it possible that we might actually see different options depending upon what option we attend to first? And I'd like to suggest that maybe we do. And what we did is we went to one of the early framing effect studies. This was a description framing effect from McNeil, Packer, Stocks, and Tversky back in 1982. And what I want us to think about, I'm first going to describe their study, but what ultimately I'm going to ask you to think about is the idea that maybe what happens is that whatever is attended to first kicks off a stream of information processing that ultimately produces different preferences. So first let me describe what they did though. So what they had is people were faced with a choice between two different treatments for lung cancer, radiation therapy and surgery. And subjects were given the information in one of two frames. They were either given the information in a survival frame, for example, all patients live through treatment, or they were given the same information, normatively equivalent information, in a mortality frame. No patients died during treatment. And what they hypothesized, and in fact what they found, was that subjects were more likely to choose surgery in the survival frame compared to the mortality frame. And they thought that was the case because the risk of death at treatment, which I have circled down at the bottom, simply looms larger in the mortality frame. And as a result, surgery is preferred less. And that description frame is what ends up mattering. Well, okay, I'll go into the attention frame idea in a minute, but let me tell you what we did first. So we actually used those materials in the study that I'm about to show you. We have an internet sample here again, but instead of having only two conditions, a mortality frame and a survival frame, we actually have 12 different between subjects conditions, and I'm going to walk you through them slowly. We do have the two description frames, survival and mortality, but we cross that with order. We have radiation on the left, or we have surgery on the left. And then we have three attention manipulations. We have a 1 in the middle, in which case, again, remember, we think that's going to divert attention just a little bit over to the left. Or we have a 9 in the middle, divert attention to the right. Or there's no integer in the middle. Now you might recall that McNeil et al. In their materials actually used two of these conditions. They used the two description frames that had radiation on the left, and of course no integer in the middle. Because why would they? It's a stupid thing to do. Why would you ever do that? And then what we had our subjects do is we had them simply express a preference from prefers radiation much more to prefers surgery much more. And what we found, so what I'm showing you here are the two conditions that McNeil et al. Actually used. So there's the survival and the mortality condition with no Arabic integer and radiations on the left. And in fact, we actually replicate exactly what they find. People prefer surgery in the survival condition compared to the mortality condition. And maybe it is the case that the risk of death at treatment simply looms larger in the mortality frame. But let's think about it a different way. What if attention actually alters the figure ground in a sense? Similar to the illusion that we looked at a moment ago. And what if whatever's attended first actually becomes the implicit reference point? And then a comparison to that implicit reference point is actually what determines the frame with which people process the information. So if we think about it that way, what you might think about is the idea that in the survival frame, you have people read from left to right. So they read first about all patients live through treatment. And maybe those 100 patients becomes the implicit reference point that then gets compared over to surgery, where 90 patients live through treatment. And maybe what happens is that what we really have here is a 100 compared to 90 and a negative attention frame in that case. And then maybe down on the bottom for what they call the mortality frame, maybe what we really have is 0, no patients die, compared to 10. And again, a negative attention frame. So maybe both of these are really a negative attention frame. And then you've got to add a little bit on top of this. The way that numbers are processed, we all know from Weber's law, we all know from the prospect theory's value function, that the value of 10 is bigger when it's closer to 0, and it's smaller when it's further away from 0. So maybe simply the value of 10 in that first information that's looked at is bigger in what's in what they call the mortality frame compared to the survival frame. And so an attention frame explanation of the exact same results right now, mind you, is that a negative attention frame is induced in both of these description frames, and 10 is simply perceived as bigger from 0 to 10 than it is from 100 to 90. So I can say what I want there, it's the same results, but let's see if we can reverse it. People read from left to right, and radiation was always on the left in the original experimental materials. What happens if we switch the order, and what would an attention frame predict? So what I'm showing you here is the exact same materials I showed you before, and all that I did is I put surgery over on the left-hand side. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. But let's think about what might happen if there's an attention frame going on here. Now we have, in what's called the survival frame, we have 90 compared to 100, and perhaps a positive attention frame. And on the bottom, we have a 10 compared to 0, 10 patients die during patients compared to none. And again, you're getting better, so you're in a positive attention frame. So in this case, surgery should still be preferred more in that 90 compared to 100 frame on the top. But now we have the case that this is a positive frame, and the effect should be attenuated compared to the negative attention frame for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the slope in the domain of gains is less steep than the slope in the domain of losses. And as a result, the value of 10, the value of 10 between the 9 compared to 100 and the 0 compared to 10, their difference is going to be less, and that should attenuate the difference between the top and the bottom frames. On top of that, we have the idea, again, because the value function is less steep in the domain of gains, and the value of 10 should be less in these two positive attention frames, it may be that what people do, since these 10 lives don't differentiate as much at that first piece of information that you look at, maybe people read further down. They don't stop just at the first piece of information, but they could then consider the second piece of information at 1 year and at 5 years. And as you continue reading down the information, if you actually do, then what ends up happening is that surgery gets preferred more and more. And what you should therefore find is, again, an attenuation of this effect because people start to read further down the information. So what do we find? We still have the original McNeil et al. Materials on the left, but on the right, and with an attention frame explanation, we reverse the order, and the effect is actually attenuated. What if we simply direct attention? We have other conditions here. We can put a 1 in the middle or a 9 in the middle. We can have radiation therapy on the left or surgery on the left. And we should make the exact same predictions because it should be based not on what's on the left-hand side, but where do people attend to the information first. And so what I'm showing you here are the two groups of conditions where people attended to radiation first, either because radiation was on the left and a 1 was presented, so they should have looked over there, or radiation was on the right and a 9 was presented, so they should have looked over there. And what you can see is what looks as if it's the usual description framing result, where surgery is preferred more in the survival condition compared to the mortality condition. Well, what happens if we switch? What happens if we switch over to surgery being attended first? The effect goes away. It gets attenuated. These are all the results, so all three groups of conditions where you attended to radiation first, surgery is preferred more in the survival condition compared to the mortality condition. And the effect goes away if you attempt surgery first. So what I'd like to suggest is that perhaps we have some evidence for sort of a new kind of preference reversal, maybe in 3 studies, that depends on attention, and it depends on the idea of selective attention, and such that just little covert incidental shifts of attention can actually influence the processing of information, can influence the framing of decision options, and ultimately influence the construction of preferences, one of Sarah's favorite topics. And so what I'd like to say now, because I had to get back to this a little bit, is thank you, Sarah. And I wanted to thank Sarah for a number of things, not only for your tremendous work in the field that has gone out in little finger ways all over the field in so many different ways, but more pragmatically. I don't know if you remember, but you actually helped me design some of my dissertation studies. We sat in the little DR library where, again, you were allowed to smoke and you weren't allowed to smoke anywhere else. You helped me in numerous grant proposals. I don't know, and often at your kitchen table in the Southeast Hills of Eugene. I don't know how many people know this, but nobody can organize and clarify ideas in writing like Sarah can. She's just amazing, and it was just a tremendous help to me, especially early on in my career. You've inspired me to be a better researcher and certainly a better writer. Your yucks have a lot of power. And for the good, not the evil. I've just so appreciated the mentoring you've given me over the year, both in terms of academic things, but also in terms of personal and professional life kinds of things. I've very much appreciated that, and appreciated your friendship. It has been just an honor and just a true pleasure to sort of grow up in the field of decision making with you as a role model. So thank you.
Thanks. Bar-Hillel. Sit down.
So I was put in charge of personal recollections, but of course my predecessors, those who have personal recollections, couldn't help but get into personal recollections themselves. And altogether, being the last to go, a lot of what I had meant to say has been said, and time is short, so I won't repeat it. But I will have a couple of personal comments to make. So the first point is, of course, Sarah, besides being a terrific researcher, is also just a mensch, a person. And in my personal recollections, I was thinking about it, but decided not to share with you her recipe for rice pilaf. She is a tremendous cook. And not to necessarily tell you about the times that she listened to my woes in romantic affairs and matters like that. All of these things are perhaps slightly too personal. I will tell you a little bit about how she raised my consciousness in terms of feminism. So I wrote science the way everybody wrote science. Everybody basically was a he. The experimenter was a he, and the participants were he's, and everybody was a he. And Sarah insisted that I be more balanced in my writing. And I had many quarrels with her over that, because I said, but writing he or she all the time is so tiresome, and you want the text to have flow, not balance. And she gave me a lot of tips on how to do that. Use the plural, that you don't have to say he or she, you just say they. Use the passive voice. So Sarah taught me a lot of these things, and I have to tell you nowadays, Sarah, when I read unbalanced writing the way I used to write myself, it bothers me a great deal, and I want to take that person in hand the way you did and teach them. Now, I'm not sure that I heard from you for the first time the famous saying, a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. But I want to bring that into the talk today, because being last, I would like to thank not just Sarah, but I would like to thank Paul too for putting together this wonderful evening, and to say, which I'm sure you've noticed, and I'm sure Sarah will be the first to agree, that in a sense, Lichtenstein without Slovic is like Kahneman without Tversky, is like Einhorn without Hogarth, is like a fish without a bicycle. Now, I will end with a little story about an experiment that Sarah ran, in which I was a participant. So this was on the question, can you train people to be better calibrated? And the design of this experiment was the subjects got a sequence of tests to perform of various degrees of difficulty, and besides choosing an answer, they were supposed to give their level of confidence. Then they got feedback from Sarah in a one-on-one tutorial where it was pointed out to them where they were miscalibrated, but they did not get feedback on the correctness of their answers to this battery of questions. And then they did the same battery of questions again, and were asked to give their confidence levels again. Now, one of the tasks was a sequence of cards in which a a sentence was repeated, and the cards came in pairs, and the task was to say which of these cards on which a Latin sentence was written, which of them was written by a European and which of them was written by an American. And I hadn't a clue. But, you know, to say I don't have a clue didn't seem like what a cooperative participant is supposed to do. So I did actually make guesses and limited my confidence as I decided deliberately. You see, I was not a completely naive respondent. I was not calibrated, but I knew enough about these things that I said to myself, don't use anything higher than 55%. So I sorted the cards into these two piles, but when I was extremely unconfident, I said 51% chance that I'm right, and when I was extremely confident, I said up to 55%. And the other tasks, I did dare use things like close to 100%, 90%, and so on. Now, I sat with Sarah in this tutorial, and she can be very persuasive. And before I will continue to tell you what I heard from that tutorial, I want to play for you, so that you'll hear how persuasive she is. I want to play to you the tape that was referred to by Eric. Now, I came in a couple of minutes late. I didn't even think I came in 3 minutes late, and the tape is 3 minutes long. So I've been told by the people sitting in my neck of the woods that you didn't all hear that tape. So maybe you'd like to, and you'll see Sarah engaging in a one-on-one exchange in a kind of tutorial with somebody, and you'll understand what.
Now, I want to ask you further about some things. Turn to page 19, will you?
Okay.
Well, you know, it's easier to look at that when I talk to you about it. Now, you, all three times in these pair comparisons, you chose bet me.
Right.
And you have no doubts in your mind about that. You also bid on these same bets. Now, let me tell you what your bids were on the bet A and bet B. Bet A is 550 points. Bet B is 400 points. Would you, if you were to do it again, change either of those bids?
I certainly wouldn't change B. 35 to 1. A, 550, you said?
Yes. Would you change that?
I don't know. Actually, I have a 1/3. It's really a 1/3 chance of winning. So we have the, approximately. So I would say not really, because 550 is approximately 1/3. So I don't think I might change it with nothing drastic. Maybe with 25 or 50 or so.
I see. May I point out to you that you bid more for bet A?
Yeah, I see that.
And yet you would really rather play, given the choice, bet B. Does that bother you in any way? Because
no, not really, because I have I have 99, what are my chances of losing, and they're not very great. And I'm talking about bet B, and they're not very much in losing. While in bet A, I'm not there's 2/3 chance that I will lose, so I would no hesitancy whatsoever in that. I would take bet B every time.
you take bet B every time. Well, then why did you bid less for it?
Because I couldn't bid any higher. But I would have. I could have, demanded, but this said 400 points, so I did the highest I could bid.
I see. Well, how about the bid for bet A? Do you have any further feelings about it now that you know that you are choosing one but bidding more for the other ones?
It's kind of strange, but no, I don't have any feelings at all toward really bad those things.
This is where I would go, but listen to Sarah.
No qualms.
No qualms. Okay. Some people would say that pattern of responses is not reasonable pattern.
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, supposing I asked you to make it reasonable, would you say, well, it's reasonable now, or would you change something?
Actually, it's reasonable.
Can I persuade you that that is an irrational pattern?
No, I don't think you probably could, but you could try.
The reason I would say it's irrational is because you choose bet B, but you value bet A more.
I see. Yeah, I see what you're.
Contradictory.
Maybe it's just that I like to go with a sure thing.
You really prefer prefer bet B over bet A, and there is no question in your mind about that. You have also made it perfectly clear to me that 400 points is your true value for bet B. You have not completely convinced me, however, that you wouldn't, maybe if I pushed you like I am, pushing you very hard, maybe if I didn't push you, you might be willing to lower that 550 for bet A. And then you would be in a position, if you lowered it below 400, you would be in a position of saying you prefer bet B and you value it more also.
But then that wouldn't be right. Or wouldn't be right.
Okay, now Sarah gives him the money, she turns him into a money palm, and she also says, this is as far as I can go without insulting you, and he says yes, but he doesn't end up really changing his mind. By the way, this reminds me of one of the subjects who committed the conjunction fallacy in Tversky and Kahneman's paper, maybe on the Linda example, where they debriefed the subject afterwards and said, they pointed out to the subjects that any feminist bank teller is a bank teller, but not vice versa. And the subject said, but I thought you were only asking for my opinion. So anyway, I was a little better than those participants, and which brings us back to our story, because here's what Sarah convinced me of, and I was convinced. She convinced me that I didn't have enough resolution to use as many numbers between 50% and 100% as I was using, and I should more or less stick to 50% guessing, 60, 70, 80. Forget about the 90 and 100 because I was overconfident, and forget about more numbers because my resolution wasn't good enough. So I accepted that, and in the second round, I only used 50, 60, 70, and 80. And which meant that in the task about the handwriting, I did do what I had initially thought I would do. I would say 50% on everything. And I was much better calibrated after the training session. And I was perfectly calibrated on the handwriting. However, it turned out that I had pretty good resolution when I was using those numbers 51 to 55. And I lost them all. So there is a little lesson here that sometimes increased calibration can be bought at a price of decreased resolution. Sarah, it was a privilege and a pleasure knowing you, and thank you very much.
And I think Sarah has actually agreed to say a little bit right at the end.
Excellent. Wonderful. All right, well, as the third risky sister to ascend to the presidency of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making, I want to thank Paul, all the contributors today, and especially Sarah Lichtenstein. Thank you so much for all your contributions on behalf of the Society. I think I know what the young people especially, but most of you are probably thinking right about now. You're thinking, oh my goodness, all the good work has already been done. Right? That's what you're thinking. I couldn't see they're nodding. Don't worry. And you're probably also thinking, all the good work's been done, and it was done by Sarah Lichtenstein. Yes, well, you know, but the other contributors showed, and there's hope, because they show that you can do good work beyond her original work. You can build on that work, and you can do more new, exciting work by building on the other work. So there is hope, and I know that you all, the young people in the audience, will be building on the things that you heard here today. So you still have something to contribute, although we have the solid foundation of that extraordinary work of Sarah Lichtenstein. Now, I do have to bring us back to many years ago when I was just a student, and I was sitting in a room not unlike this room. The whole society could meet at the same time in a small room like this. And as Elke alluded, you know, there weren't too many women in that audience. You go to the ladies' room, and there was no line. There was nobody in there. And seriously, when somebody went home early, you know, it'd be one or two of us and Sarah Lichtenstein. And we really did get strength from that. We talked about it. You know, we didn't tell you necessarily, but we got tremendous strength from that. You know, gender shouldn't matter. You know, it shouldn't have mattered then, but it did matter. We did feel strange. We did feel like we stood out in a way. And you know, it still matters, gender. It's not, those days are not completely behind us. But we really were inspired by you as a role model. But you know, it was more than the fact that she was a woman. It was so much more than that. It was that her work was so damn good. That was the part that really, it was that combination of, you know, there was a role model, a woman, but such superb work. It was breathtaking. I remember saying about one of the things, and you know, I know it's going to seem hyperbolic, but we really felt it. It was like reading a novel. So exciting, that work, and it still is today when I look at it again, and it certainly has inspired my own work, going back to the lexicographic work and the work I've done now on gist and qualitative thinking, all the way to the categorical thinking type work that's very similar to Hsee's work. Definitely has its roots in your work, and I go back and I look at it again, and it's just as good. It's just as good as I remember it being. So I wanted to thank you for your inspiration to all of us as a role model, but also for your aspiration. Because, you know, maybe we can't be as damn good as Sarah Lichtenstein, but we have something to shoot for. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank everybody. I feel very honored. It's a terrific feeling. I particularly want to thank Paul because this is all his idea. And can you imagine doing a whole career working with Paul Slovic?
What a great night. Thank you all. Some of you people have traveled a good way around the world today to be here. You must be tired. Thanks for coming here tonight and honoring Sarah. Thanks to all our presenters who did a wonderful job under time pressure. Did a great job, and I think they showed how much fun it is to do JDM work, how we can build on what each of us does. We don't have to do the same things, but this is a community that pays attention to what everyone else is doing, and I think we have made a lot of progress, and we're going to continue to make a lot of progress. So thanks again for this great night. Good night. Can I ask the presenters to just stick around, and we'll take a couple pictures before we wake up.
Yes. That was good. Oh, it's right. Oh my God. I'm trying to figure out how to get this tape out again.
What's the
Yeah. I don't even know how to turn it off. I mean, oh, it's recording it again.